Part 6. Garrett's Gun Shop, 10:23 p.m. Rob Garrett, behind the glass counter, looked up into the steel blue eyes of the customer. He looked like a weightlifter, but he was dressed like those crazy kids on Melrose. Probably a nut. City was full of them. They came in all sizes here. Rob had first got into the drugstore business in Bangor, Maine, 14 years ago. Rob was the adventurous type, he thought, so he packed his bags and headed west. He'd always collected guns himself, so he had taken over this shop on Sunset Boulevard. At first, he had been wary of dealing with the serious issue lowlives who came into the shop, but in the last few years he had learned to spot the dangerous ones, and mostly avoided trouble. This guy was not especially dangerous looking. His expression was slack, blank, except when he looked up at the rack of weapons behind the counter. Then his face drew into a focused cone of concentration. His eyes paused on each gun, as if he could identify every one. Rob's attention was piqued. Maybe a fellow collector? The desire to make contact with one of his own kind caused Rob to ignore the man's weird clothes and look at the man. Hell, gun collectors come in all packages. "Can I help you, sir?" he said hopefully. Gun collectors also spent a lot of money. Finally, the man lowered his unblinking gaze to Rob, only now reacting as if he existed. He began asking for the heavy artillery, the semi-automatics, the military stock Garrett didn't want to carry but did anyway, because it was beginning to sell very well. They were all perfectly legal guns, unless you knew how to file the pins off the semi-automatics to make them steady fire. Shit, Rob thought. This guy does have good taste. He trundled back and forth, pulling a formidable arsenal off the racks. In a voice that sounded as if the man were buying razor blades, he said, "I want to see the Spaz 12 auto-feed shotgun." "That's both pump action and auto, you know," Rob interjected. The man kept his eyes on the racks. "Armalite, AR-180 semi-auto assault rifle," he requested. As Rob pulled it from the rack, the customer continued. "The Desert Eagle 357 semi-automatic, gas-operated pistol with 10-round magazine. The AR-15 5.56 carbine with collapsible buttstock." Rob was panting a little, trying to keep up. The man was continuing in a dull voice. "Phased plasma pulse rifle in 40-watt range." Rob froze in confusion, trying to reconcile the request with his in-store stock, then narrowed his eyes at the customer. Phased plasma. Very funny. "Hey pal, just what you see. Anything else?" Rob was thinking that the guy must have been in the service, the way he was selecting the weapons, and his manner cried out Marines. Or who knows, maybe this bird was a real mercenary. The customer picked up a Colt 45, 2-inch over long slide automatic, eyeing the laser targeting device mounted on top. It looked like a scope, but it was actually a small laser generator with internal battery power. When the man depressed the trigger slightly, a bright, nail-thin beam of red light shot out of the end of the device. "That's a good gun," Rob said. "They just come in. You aim the dot where you want the bullet to go. You can't miss." The customer was aiming the beam at the walls, at the display rack behind Rob. At Rob. Wherever the beam met a surface, it made a tiny, intense ball of light. It was beautiful to watch the customer. He was moving the bolt back and forth, over and over, almost as if he could become an extension of the weapon itself. Fascinating. The man moved his eyes carefully over the shelves all again while working the actions of the growing pile of weapons, seeming to familiarize himself instantly with their operation. Then he turned that steady gaze on the owner again. "Uzi, 9mm. Rob went to get it, saying, "You know your weapons, buddy. Any one of these is ideal for home defense." Rob watched for a smile, but it didn't come. Screw the jokes. Better tend to business. "Which ones do you want?" "All," the taciturn man said, toneless and certain. Rob raised his eyebrows. "I may close early today. There's a 15-day wait on the handguns, but the rifles you can take right now." Rob began wrapping them up, but turned when he heard the rattle of shell casings on glass. The man was calmly ripping open a box of 12-gauge cartridges and sliding them rapidly into the autoloader. "Hey, you can't do that." The man faced Rob and raised the shotgun to his face. The customer said, "Wrong." Rob thought for a moment that it was another stupid joke, and then, a second before the shotgun blast, in a quiet revelation, he realized that he should have stayed in Maine. The Terminator carried the weapons and the sacks of ammunition to the station wagon and put them in the back. They were primitive killing machines, but he estimated his firepower was comfortably above the minimum requirement for this situation. After he'd first stolen the station wagon, it had taken him about 16 minutes to adjust to the random pattern of city traffic. Twice he had run cars onto the sidewalk, and once he had ploughed through an intersection and sideswiped an RTD bus. But then he had learned to calculate the ebb and flow of the vehicles, and through memory and analysis of contextual activity pieced together the rules of the road. He was learning his way around. Panama Hotel, 11:19 a.m. The Terminator sat at a small table, carefully filing away the welded plate that prevented the Uzi from firing full auto. He had finished converting and loading all the other weapons within 30 minutes by working in a steady, tireless rhythm. The plate dropped out with a quiet clink. A squeeze of the trigger would now unleash 9mm bullets at a cyclic rate of fire just over 800 rounds per minute, the secret of the Uzi's legendary firepower. He loaded a full magazine into the auto pistol, then placed it on the bed alongside the other weapons. He had carried them in through the fire escape window. This was his base of operations. It had to be secure. Therefore, he could not bring attention to it by any overtly aggressive behavior, such as outright life denial. He knew enough about this society to avoid doing anything that would jeopardize this neutral zone. That was why he paid the desk clerk for the room. That was why he needed a back entrance to the room. But away from the room, he could do anything he wanted without concern, because he would be constantly on the move, constantly driving forward until he reached and terminated his assigned target. After that, nothing mattered. The Terminator stood up, gathered extra magazines, filling his pockets, and selected the Uzi, the laser sight 45, and the nickel-plated 38 pistol. For his first run, he wanted to go light. If there had to be a second, he would have ample backup firepower. Then he slipped out the window and crawled easily down the fire escape to the alley and his car. It was time to access the target. Silver Lake District, sunset near Fountain Boulevard, 11:42 a.m. The Canadian never knew what hit him. He was a bear of a man, weighing in at 245 before lunch, his broad face, with its thick features, fringed with a beard. Carlisle Ladle was a carbide steel tool and die maker working on a green card and studying for citizenship. 20 minutes ago, he had hopped on his Harley 900 to run an errand for his boss. 2 minutes later, the muffler from a rust-smudged 1968 Dodge van fell into the road in front of him. He was making a turn and side-slipped on the muffler, going over before he could get his legs down for support. His injuries were minor, a small gash on his wrist and a slightly gouged kneecap. The Harley was trashed. So he parked the chopper on the sidewalk and sauntered in low-boil frustration half a block to a phone booth. Cursing under his breath with impatience, Carlisle waited while the phone on the other end rang 12 times. His old lady sure as hell loved her fucking beauty sleep. She finally came on and was in the process of wondering who had the balls to wake her up after a long hard night, when someone with a powerful grip lifted Carlisle off his feet and swung him like a ragdoll into a nearby parked car. He slid onto his massive butt with a bone-crunching thud. He was about to bellow his rage and leap on the interloper when he saw the man's eyes. There was nothing in them. No anger or meanness. Nothing but defocused zip. He was grabbing the phone book and leafing through it, as if Carlisle had ceased to exist. He was a big man. Carlisle was bigger. He pulled himself to his feet and said to the other's back, "You got a serious attitude problem, man." but this had no seeming effect on the man in the phone booth. The receiver was swinging back and forth at the end of the cord. This was too much. Carlyle started for the man, but just then he saw the back stiffen and noticed the man's finger, which had been running down the column of names, lock into a frozen position over one, then jerk to the next and the next. Abruptly, the man turned to leave. Carlyle considered getting in his way until he saw the eyes again. They were looking right at him, but seeing something else entirely. Something in the near future that might have been of interest, but certainly not here and now. He pushed past Carlyle and jumped behind the wheel of a station wagon and sped away. Carlyle swallowed. It was only now that he realized the man had frightened him. He had never been looked at like that. He never wanted to be again. Sighing, he stepped into the booth to redial his house. His eyes went down to the open page of the phone book the man had been looking at. There was an indentation along 3 names, a depression caused by the man's fingers digging into the paper. The 3 names were Sarah Ann Connor, Sarah Helene Connor, and Sarah Jeanette Connor. Carlyle stared at them as the phone rang at his house. For a moment, a mere fraction of time, he considered dialing the numbers and warning the women that someone very spooky was looking for them. But the notion was fragile and easily crushed into forgetfulness when his wife came on the line and he began to explain his own problems to her. 11.5 hours later, he would be sitting in his ratty easy chair in front of the TV, watching the late news. His wife would be startled by the expression of horror that would make his face an alien sight. For a while, all he would be able to say was, "I should have called. I should have called." West Los Angeles Junior College, 11:53 a.m. The flat was the last straw. Sarah marched up to the Honda and nodded fatalistically at the deflated rear wheel. It wasn't even close to fair. There was no reason for this to have happened to her. Okay, maybe she'd find a nail in the treads, sure, but why today? Why not tomorrow? Or yesterday? In either case, she had a light schedule and could have easily accommodated disaster. But today, why? Things had begun well enough. After leaving her apartment, she'd had an uneventful and dreamy ride to school. Traffic was surprisingly mild, and the drivers had been uncommonly alert and gracious. So she had allowed herself to do something very suicidal when riding a 2-wheeled vehicle in Los Angeles city traffic. Daydream. She was thinking about Stan Morsky and their date that night. She hadn't planned on it, but the images welled up over the vision of the road before her and simply washed reality away. She remembered his dark blue eyes and his smile. It wasn't especially sincere, but it was smooth, and it was inspired by her. Okay, she had to admit, it wasn't anything like the expression Ginger could inspire in Matt, but it reminded her of a smile she'd been able to inspire 2 years ago, senior year, standing in the hall after school with Rich Welker. A super sweet smile, marred only slightly by a chipped tooth that he was quick to remind everyone he had won in a knockdown victory game with the former Football League champs. He was varsity letter, class president, and a class act with his wardrobe. His parents were wealthy, of course. She had managed to get into cheerleading squad just so she could be near him. For months he was polite and available to everyone but her. Finally, one day in the hall, he saw her for the first time, framed by her open locker. No one was around. He kissed her, and then he smiled for her. They had 3 dates before he told her he was marrying the homecoming queen. Hurriedly, Sarah clicked that thought off and went back to Stan. He was a lot like Rich. Classy, handsome, drove a Porsche, with a dreamy expression and a gorgeous smile. He was funny and polite, and when he asked her out, she had been surprised. There was no warning. She was waiting his table, and he would make amusing comments from time to time as she made certain he was being well looked after. When a customer in the next booth started giving her a hard time, he had bailed her out with a joke that diffused the situation. As she was thanking him for coming to her rescue, he asked her to go out to the concert with him. The only major problem she faced now was what to wear. This guy was really upscale. Maybe Ginger would help her decide. Then her scooter began to stutter and cough. It was dying underneath her. It rolled to a stop in the middle lane. Cars on all sides began honking, the drivers quickly turning vicious as their deepest hostilities burst through the thin veneer of patience to find a convenient target. She somehow was unsurprised, and that was what surprised her as she walked the dead scooter to the curb. Then she realized why she was not surprised. She remembered forgetting to put gas in the Honda last night on her way home from the library. Lame. Okay, just a few minutes behind schedule so far, no big deal. She walked the scooter a block to a gas station, and that was that. Her first class on Fridays was a real adventure, linguistics. Professor Miller kept her after class for her increasingly frequent tardiness. Sarah's next major crisis was in Psych 104. Rod Smith was one of the few men on campus who had discerned that the most beautiful women took psych classes. The lech had been hitting on every girl except Sarah. Today was her lucky day. He was 2 seats away, glancing out of the corner of his eye at her bare legs. Sarah cursed herself for not wearing jeans, but it was such a nice day, and she loved the way the wind felt on her skin when she rode the scooter in her shorts. Rod was reminding her, unconsciously of course, about the unwritten law of the civilized jungle. If you wear something sexy, men have a right to stare. She decided to ignore Rod, and although he did not exactly go away, he did shrink in her mind to a small nuisance, until class was over. He followed her outside and walked with her across the quad, striking up an amiable conversation. She wasn't listening to the words, she was hearing the tone, which was urgent and hungry. He probably wasn't listening to himself either. He concluded with, "And we haven't talked much. I think we should. There's a lot we could learn from one another." Sarah stopped walking and faced him. There was no sign in his eyes that he was capable of distinguishing her from any other female on campus. She wasn't Sarah, she was simply a romantic target. It would be especially nice if he vanished, so she said, "The only thing I want to learn from you, Rod, is what you look like when you're walking away." She was amazed to see the effect this had on him. Suddenly humbled, his face reddened, and with much embarrassment, he sauntered off. It was an act, she thought. Wasn't it? God, she didn't mean to come off so hard. Maybe this poor guy did have some feelings for her. Then she reached her Honda and saw the flat. She called Rod back. It was an impulse that would haunt her later. She went into that pretty smile, and Rod brightened up. In a few minutes he was grunting at her feet, patching and repairing the tire. She realized that she would have to repay his generosity, and so did he. When Rod finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and slipped an arm around her waist. He pulled her to him and said, "I knew you'd come around." There was the look, mutating his face into what suddenly seemed to Sarah to be the textbook example of slack-jawed lust. She couldn't help herself. She laughed. As she watched Rod stomp off in anger, she realized she had made an enemy. Wonderful, Sarah thought, and mounted the scooter. Not too bad a day so far. As Sarah rode off to work, she allowed herself the feeble hope that she might only be a few minutes late. Surely this morning, which would live in infamy, was enough to appease the gods. But sometimes the gods are never satisfied.